Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's test we are going to have a look at two positions in which plans are key, exact variations not important. Okay, sorry for not mentioning which side it is to move in one of yesterday's positions. So from now on you can see it on the screen. You will see either a B or a W on the screen next to the position number. So today in both positions it's white to play. Okay. Let's start with the first position. This is from one of my training games. Pause the video, time yourself, analyze over a real board and write your analysis down. And most importantly, don't move the pieces. We are trying to recreate real over the board tournament conditions. Okay, pause the video, see you in a minute. Okay, so this position is a typical Sicilian structure in which black has played e5, it's an Najdorf, and I played the g3 Zagreb variation against it. And my opponent made, I'll just show you this briefly, made a mistake early on of playing knight to c6. This knight really doesn't belong to c6, it should go to d7. The reason is, against this I can simply play bishop to g5. And this is not winning or that much better for white, but what I want to do is, once this happens, trade off the bishop, and now I have more control over the d5 square. Okay, so coming back to the original position. So the material is completely equal. Strategically, white should be better. However, it's not easy to exploit this strategic advantage if you don't understand what it is. So we are fighting for the d5 square. What we want to achieve is a good knight versus bad bishop position. I wanted to show you this position, even though it's not too hard, because it's very typical, and I think it's important not to play useless moves which don't really do anything for your position. So I'd played the move pawn to c3. The reason why I did that is because I'd done a lot of analysis on positions like this, and I saw that c3 I can get away with. So the downside of c3 is that I don't have knight c3. Ideally I want to play knight c3, queen d3, knight d5. Great position. However, in those cases there is knight b4 attacking the c2 pawn in conjunction with the c8 rook. That's annoying. Sometimes there is even knight to d4, trying to trade off my knight before I can do anything. I never really want to play c4 in these positions, because then I would have to trade this guy for this guy, and then we are just in an opposite colored position, opposite colored bishop position. So I played c3, and now since c3 is on the board, it's pretty hard to find a way to improve your position. So normal moves don't really do much. I mean, you can play rook d2 or rook d3, but the problem with these is that maybe rook c5 is coming at some point, not necessarily now because knight a5 is not possible, but maybe at some point, and then your queen maybe has to go to b3, and then maybe queen to e6 trades off queens favorably for black. So doubling up rooks is a plan, but it doesn't really achieve that much. You can play h4, which restricts this bishop, which is always a good idea. There is really no downside to this move. It's not as if black can start attacking you, but again, it doesn't really do much. You can play bishop to h3. That's also a move attacking the rook, but the rook gets to c7 and doesn't really, well, bishop h3 doesn't really achieve much either. So what you have to look for is a plan to make your position optimal. And when you're in a position where it's hard to find the plan, you need to look for your worst placed piece. So your worst placed piece and potentially your best piece in this structure is the knight on e2. How do you improve it? Well, what you'd like to do, ideally, is get the knight to e3. Okay, so this should be your fantasy position. You have a knight on e3. And if you can get a knight to e3, then you are strategically much better, maybe even strategically winning. That doesn't mean that you cannot blunder later on, but okay, now it takes some time to get the knight there. There isn't really an easy route to do it either. So what can you do? There's basically only one good starting move in this position, and that's knight to c1. which is what I'd played. But this move is not as important as its idea and the follow-up. So knight c1 does two things. Firstly, if black just waits, you're going to do this. Knight b3, knight a1, knight c2, knight e3, queen d3, knight d5, game over. White is just much better, huge control over the entire board, no chance for any sort of counterplay. In that case, you would have to probably be aware of bishop to g5. When your knight gets to e3, black would happily trade it off, and that way you actually have a bad bishop. But it's not that black is not going to be doing anything. Now, you had to combine this idea with another idea. Once your knight gets to b3, it's preventing knight a5, which is very important. It's also stopping rook c5. That means that your queen can move and there are no tricks. Okay. Another thing is, once this knight moves, you don't have to go to a1 and then to c2 and then to e3 and then to d5. You can play knight to b3, rook to d3, rook f to d1, knight to d2, and then knight f1, knight e3. That's another way to go. That way, once your knight is on f1, you can include the move h4 and then play knight e3. So, I'd expected this move from my opponent, queen e6, and it's an okay move. Trading queens is neither good or bad for either side. If I'm black, I would want to keep the queens on the board because it keeps d6 protected, and that's another problem in black's position. Often the square in front of the backwards pawn is a bigger problem, but in this case and in many cases the backwards pawn in itself is a big weakness and a big deal. So I never want to take. Taking the queen would be absurd because that would defend d6, defend d5 and give my opponent the option to play d5 later on, liquidating into a drawn endgame. So I just continued with my plan, knight to b3. Again, if he takes the queen here, I happily take with the rook. There's no way for him to improve his position. He can never play d5. For example, queen takes, rook takes, knight e7, rook to d3. He cannot play d5. I have 3 defenders. So I played knight to b3. And here he played rook to c7, which is a weird move. That's a very weird move. So the only thing I can see is that it gets away from bishop h3. But on bishop h3 he takes my queen anyway, so he doesn't really have to do that. He doesn't really have the option to double with rook to d7 because bishop to h3 again is an annoying move, so rook c7 doesn't really do much. Now I had the option to play knight a1 to continue with my plan, but there's one thing I didn't like about it. If I go knight a1, then he goes knight e7 and my pawn is hanging. So I would have to play queen to b3, and after queen b3, a b3, white is still better, but it's not as easy to do what I wanted. Okay, so maybe now doubles and this, so I would have to play bishop h3. So I just continued normally. I just played rook to d3. Again, I'm not afraid of him taking on d5. I just want to double up my rooks, put tremendous pressure on the d6 pawn and win the game. And once my rook is here, I can then go knight a1 and do this, or I can go knight d2, knight f1, knight e3. Here he played rook c to d7, which is just a blunder, and after this the game is basically over, which goes to show how a good plan can end the game quickly and how useless moves in the same position would have led you nowhere. So I just continued rook f to d1, and again, he doesn't have to trade queens, but he can trade queens, and he did. It's very hard to find a move if he doesn't trade queens, because on knight e7 I can now just simply go queen a5, and my knight is still on b3, so everything's protected, and he still doesn't have d5. So in this position he played queen takes d5, rook takes d5, knight e7, rook 5 to d3, and it's over. The game is just over. Whatever he does in this position, I can either play knight c5 or even better bishop h3. If it's white to move bishop h3, just wins the game. So he has to give up a pawn. There is no way to save the pawn. So he played d5 and the game quickly ended. E takes d5, rook to d6, knight to c5, threatening both knight b7 and knight e4, rook b8, knight e4, rook to d7, c4, rook b to d8, bishop h3, and he loses the exchange as well. Game over. So even though this position seems better for white, and it is slightly better for white, you still have to be aware of what you have to do. Hopefully you solved this one. Hopefully you saw the correct plan, and if you're familiar with positions like this, then it may not have been as useful, but hopefully you got something from it anyway. Now, this is an endgame I was analyzing yesterday, and I was trying to look for some interesting endgames to go over, and I stumbled upon this one. So it's white to play again, you can see it on the screen. Find the plan. Again, exact moves. You need to find the plan. Okay, pause the video, solve the position, see you in a minute. Good luck. Okay, so white is visually better. Why is white visually better? Well, there's pressure on the b5 pawn. That's one thing. The other thing is white's king is further up the board, so white's king is better than black's king. It's as simple as that. Black has no real way to make progress with his pawns, and white does. So that's another thing, flexibility of the rook and of the pawns. One very important thing in this position, which hopefully you saw, is that if the black rook should move and white takes on b5, for example, black plays here and you take, black is going to play rook to d3 and take your a3 pawn, and that's going to be an equal position, so that's very important. So what can you do here? There are a couple of things you can do. If you try to prevent black from getting into your position while at the same time you're trying to win the b5 pawn, then you probably thought of king to f3, and that's aimed at, for example, rook to d7, king to e2. So now you think the rook has to go back, and white has made progress, and the position is great, the rook is locked down. Not really true. Black can play rook to d5, and if you check, he can either cover or just play king to d7, king to d7, rook to b6, king to c7, and it's a drawn position. So guarding the infiltration squares doesn't really work, so that doesn't work. The engine plays a move which, for a human, maybe it's easy to see and easy to understand, but it doesn't really achieve much. So the engine plays rook e5 check, and after king f6, the engine plays e4. Now, what you don't want to do in this position is liquidate pawns if you want to win. Since you are slightly better, at least visually, you shouldn't be trading off pawns. So black takes, king takes, I don't know, rook c7 maybe. And now again, if you take, then rook c3, and it should be an equal position, rook a5, rook a3. White cannot really win this. Of course, it's easier for black to make a mistake, but... So the engine wants to make progress with rook e5 and e4, or e4. Okay, what else can you do? You can play rook c6 check, king f7, e4, trying to, again, push your e-pawn forward, fe4, king e4, rook to d7. If you go rook b6 in this position, thinking, well, great, I'm going to win this guy, and there is no rook d3, but there's rook d1, and again, after rook takes b5, rook a1, and it doesn't really matter that you won a tempo, it's still pretty much the same position. So what can you do? Well, black just played king to e6, and there's a specific idea behind that move. The idea is he wants to go king f6 and then play h6, g5 and try to liquidate pawns on that side of the board. We already know what's happening on the queen side. So how can you prevent that? Well, there is a great move here, which the engine thinks it's okay, but it's not the move itself, it's the idea behind the move. And the move is h5. And this basically gives black the move. Okay, so black has to make a decision in this position, and it also gives black the possibility to make a mistake. Another thing it does, it prepares the move h6, which in many variations, if this rook wanders away too far, can be very scary, because, for example, rook c7 takes on h7. I should mention that if gh5, black is just busted. he's just busted. Rook takes f5, rook c7, for example, rook takes b5, rook to c3, rook takes h5, and there's no going back from this position. This is just all over. Rook b3, rook a7, takes e4, and white is easily winning this endgame because he has two passed pawns, and black's pawn is under complete control. So after h5, black only has one sensible option. He has to go closer to the pawns with king f6. And now that white has managed something, there's a slight improvement in the position. White needs to go for the second part of his plan. The second part is rook c6 check. And black plays king f7, fine. And now, how do you make further progress? Well, if you try stuff like king g5, then maybe rook to d7 and enough counterplay, or definitely, because you're not in time to take the b pawn, and black may just queen his pawn. So you need to play precisely. So rook to c5. Okay, now what has happened is that you have made progress with the h5 pawn, otherwise the position is pretty similar. So what black has to do is just say, okay, you didn't do anything, king f6, and if there's a repetition, fine. Otherwise, you have to try and win with one of your other pawns. Ideally, you play e4, and maybe you have something, but if black plays correctly, probably a draw. For a human, though, it's very hard to play a move like king f6, which doesn't do much, thinking that the king on f7 is equally good. So in this position, Tony Miles blundered and lost the game, which is what Ulf Andersson had set up with the move h5. He played the move rook to d7, thinking that the same stuff still works. Like if you take on b5, I play rook d3, blah, blah, blah. Which is what happened. You're going to see why it doesn't work here. So rook takes b5, rook to d3, and now the key move, rook to b7 check. The king is not on f6. Okay, if the king was on f6, this firstly wouldn't be check. Secondly, the king could just go forward. Okay, so in this position, you don't have any good moves. If you play king g8 trying to defend your pawn, then h6, and this is the key. Rook a3, and rook to a7, threatening mate. The king has to go back, and now you just push your pawns, queen your pawns. Game over, the king is stuck in the corner. If after rook b7 you play king f6, then rook takes h7. Okay, g5, some counterplay, fine, king f3, rook takes a3, rook a7, passed pawn, game over. And Ulf Andersson went on to win that game easily. I'm going to say rook a2 was played, rook a6 check, king e5, g4, fg4, king g4, rook g2 check, king h3, and the two passed pawns are just way too much, and the a4 pawn is under attack as well. Rook b2 played, which I don't really understand. He wants to take the e4 pawn, the e3 pawn instead of the pawn on b4, but yeah, it's just, this is how the game ended. Of course, it's an easy win for white, and in this position, Tony Miles resigned. Hopefully you got something from that one. I mean, finding this idea in a basically drawn position according to the engines, is not easy, but that's the way to win games. That's how you win. Okay, thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you got something from these two positions in today's daily chess test. Let me know what you think about them. I'm reading all the comments. Any feedback is appreciated. If you have any ways for me to improve these tests, please let me know. And yeah, thanks again. Stay tuned for more chess. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.